But I'm not convinced that God is omniscient and omnipotent either. I think God is in the process of becoming. God is not only just becoming, but is becoming, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, so being and becoming.
More time. Becoming. I think
more
that becoming is the important thing.
Why do you think that? I mean, it's also a strange segue. I mean, I'm not criticizing, but I'm curious. What drove you to that conclusion?
An awful lot of things, really. I think that everything is a process. In fact, I'm writing a book called There Are No Things.
Oh, what are there instead?
There are processes.
Yes.
And there are patterns.
Patterns. Yes. That's why I think music is so powerful.
Music is one of the most mysterious and wonderful things in the universe. And I don't think it's at all foolish of people to have thought that the planetary motions were in some way
like...
No,
it's not at all foolish.
No,
it's a great insight.
Kind of music. I think it is a very important insight.
Well, in music, I've thought, and I've said this in public lectures, that music is the most representative of the arts. Because the world is made out of patterns. And music describes how those patterns should be arranged.
You're using representative in a very different way.
I know, it depends on what you mean by representative. And so it's representing the ultimate reality of the cosmos.
Well, I would like to say presentative, in that it's not representing anything. It is actually, when we're in the presence of music, something is coming into being which is at the core of the whole cosmic process.
I think that's why people love music.
They do, and I mean, there's hardly any originality in the idea, because lots of physicists say this, that the sort of the movements of atoms and the movements of planets and so forth are more like a dance or more like music than they are like things bumping into one another. Right.
See, I thought of things as patterns that people have made into tools.
I agree with you, and tools are what the left hemisphere is always looking for. It's always looking for something to grasp.
Right.
It reifies processes that it's all a matter of time. Every single thing, including the mountain behind my house, if you were able to, which is billions of years old, if you were able to take as it were, a series of, like a time-lapse camera, you'd see the thing morphing and changing and flowing. Everything flows, as Heraclitus once said, everything flows, it's just a question of over the time period that you consider it.
It's a question of tempo.
It's a question of the tempo.
Definitely.
And so taking time out of things and considering them in the abstract, deracinated from context, particularly from the flow and from the context of time, changes them into something else. And I think that what in brief, what Plato has done and what a lot of the history of more recent Christianity has done is to thingify God and heaven, perfect states that are unaltered and so on. And I think that it is an ever more wonderfully self-exploring, self-actualizing process that requires a degree of opposition. As a stream, in order to have the movement and the eddies and patterns in it.
I've had intimations like that about death. Like when I've experienced, it's hard to describe these experiences, but when I've contemplated death deeply, it has struck me as a fundamental repair mechanism. Like it's part of the mechanism by which new things that are better are brought into being.
Absolutely.
And I mean, you see that in your own being, because of course, without death, you couldn't live. Right?
Yes.
Because you're dying. The things about you that aren't right, even at a physiological level, are dying all the time.
They are.
Unfortunately, you also completely die, which seems to be a bit on the unfortunate side. But more cosmically speaking, it does seem to me that death is I don't know, man. I've had intuitions or intimations that death is the friend of being, and that's like it's hard to get my head around that. But
I completely agree with you, and indeed that's been said by many wiser people than myself, and maybe even than yourself.
I would suspect so. Hopefully,
but I mean I think that's right. That death is predicated on life, but also that it shouldn't be seen as a sort of something that's negative. It's a necessary stage in the process of becoming what it is. And since everything is ramified, since nothing is just isolated, you and I may look as though, feel as though, but as you often eloquently say, we all have a history And we have, in time, we come from a place, but also as a culture we have history. We can't detach ourselves from it. We're expressions of it, but we're also inevitably dependent, as all organisms are, on the environment. Where I end and where the quote environment begins is I don't like the word environment, I prefer nature, which suggests something that's always being born, whereas environment suggests something around me from which I'm separated. But anyway, all of that is
and
connected.
Even opposed to.
Yes. So I would see us as like an eddy in a stream, or like a wave in the sea that is never separate.
Schrödinger talked about life as
I mean, the comings together of physics with a process philosophy are very strong.
So when does that book come out?
When I finish writing it.
Yeah.
And I'm very worried that it's getting bigger, and it's, all the time I'm writing it, I'm seeing more and more of things that I really must get to know more about, and it's an ever receding.
Well, it's the danger of a book that aims at something fundamental, because you never hit the proper boundaries.
That's it. I need that wall. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I also had experiences, I would say, that when I was trying to understand, they're imaginative experiences when I was trying to understand, let's say, the necessity of evil. Because that's also a fundamental theological conundrum and a metaphysical conundrum. Why is it that being is constituted such that evil is allowed to exist? Right? It's Ivan Karamazov's critique of Alyosha's Christianity, essentially. What kind of God would allow for this sort of thing?
It's the ancient question.
Yeah, it's an ancient question. And I mean, part of what I thought, I thought about the adversarial element to that, which is that you need a challenge, because you're not forced to bring forth what you could bring forth without a challenge. And the greater the thing that you're supposed to bring forth, the greater the challenge has to be. So you need an adversary. It's something like that.
Yes.
But then I also thought that it's possible that being requires limitation. You might say optimal being requires free choice. I know I'm going through a lot of things quickly. Free choice requires the real distinction between good and evil, because without that you don't have choice. Well, so maybe it's possible to set up a world where evil is a possibility, but where it isn't something that has to be manifest. Where it's an option open to you, and a real option, and it has to be, and a challenge that was presented to you, but it's something that you cannot move towards if you so desire. And that seems to me to be something like the ethical requirement. That's the fundamental ethical requirement, to avoid evil.
Well, I'm sure
that doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. That's not the same issue.
No, it isn't. And I wonder, one could recast it as the need for otherness. God needs something other. And that other, if it's not going to be just part of God, has got to be free. Otherwise there will be no creation. I mean, the nature that there is something other than God, it may in the end come from and come back to that God. Or that divine essence, or that whatever. But there's a wonderful...
Yeah, something I can't figure out either. Like in the Christian idea, there's the end of time where the evil is separated from God forever. Yes. And I think about that as a metaphysical... Well, you might think, if it's a form of... Like, imagine it's a form of perfection, a form of striving for perfection. You fragment yourself, you challenge yourself, you throw what's not worthy into the fire, everlasting, something like that. And so what you end up with retained is much better than what you started with through the trials, something like that.
Well, that sounds